Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Jonathan Eig, the author of King, A Life. He's written 6 books and is a former newspaper reporter for many papers, including the Wall Street Journal. Thanks so much for being here, Mr. Eig.
Thank you. Call me John, please.
There you go. Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Somehow, the life and contributions of Martin Luther King Jr., at least in contemporary popular culture, particularly in news coverage, have been boiled down to one phrase that he made during one speech, the I Have a Dream speech, where he says, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. We hear it over and over in news coverage and in popular culture when it comes to Martin Luther King. The sad thing is, of course, there are many, many lines that should be memorable in that speech. And we are thrilled to welcome Jonathan to the show, the best-selling author of this new momentous biography of Martin Luther King. First of all, Jonathan, what does it say about our current moment that an epic address, an epic speech gets whittled down for some reason to that one line, which is used to try to explain all of race relations in one snappy little soundbite?
I think it says that we are uncomfortable with the nuance and with the persistence of racism, that we're trying to simplify the message to the one that is the most palatable. Of all the lines in that speech, the one that is the simplest and sort of the most kindergarten level. You know, it's important to start teaching Dr. King in kindergarten. I'm okay with that, but we haven't advanced much beyond that. And as adults, I think we can handle a little more complexity.
There are many examples of episodic histories written about Martin Luther King, including several we've had on this show by very fine authors, and they're outstanding books. But when it comes to cradle to grave biographies, as they're called, the famed Stephen Oates, who was a Lincoln biographer, wrote a full life of Martin Luther King. David Garrow wrote one. Taylor Branch wrote a momentous 3-volume set on the entire civil rights movement. How and when did you decide that Martin Luther King Jr. needed the full treatment once again?
I was interviewing people for my Ali book who also happened to know Martin Luther King.
And that's Muhammad Ali, right? That's who you're talking about. Right? Okay,
Ali,
right. One name will do it for him, right? Yeah.
Yeah, not Stan and Ali.
Right.
Muhammad Ali.
Right.
I was interviewing Ali people like Dick Gregory and Andy Young and Harry Belafonte, Jesse Jackson, people who knew Muhammad Ali, and they also knew Martin Luther King. And in those conversations, I just became curious, and I began asking them questions about Martin Luther King. What was he like? You know, it's worth remembering that King would only be 94 years old right now, and his older sister, God bless her, is still alive. So I just felt like what an opportunity I had to talk to people about King who knew him. And that's when I realized that it had been 40 years since the Stephen Oates book and 25 years or more since the David Garrow, Taylor Branch books, and that those were different kinds of books. I wanted to write something more intimate, something that really made you feel like you could know the man.
And I will tell you, this is really a wonderful book. I've read hundreds of biographies, not just about presidents, but about many historical figures. And this is really on its way to be, and I'm very stingy with 5 stars, but this is really on its way to being a 5-star book. You've heard it from people well beyond my stature in society, but I just wanted to let you know that it really is a heck of an effort that you put forth here.
Thank you, Evan. I appreciate that.
Recently released FBI documents, White House recordings, personal letters, business records, diaries nobody else had seen, autobiographies people had written, memoirs, even audio tapes recorded by Coretta after her husband's death. You have access to a memoir written by Martin Luther King Jr.'s father, Martin Luther King Sr. How did you find all these new sources about one of the most famous people in world history, someone so famous that even a piece of garbage that he'd held in his hands would probably be considered a historical artifact? How did you find all this?
I was pleasantly surprised at how much stuff was out there because, there are at least 3 libraries dedicated to King's legacy and archiving his materials. Boston University, Stanford University, and one at the King Center in Atlanta. But I found stuff that they didn't know existed. And some of it just comes from good old fashioned newspaper reporting tools. I follow up, I call, I look for people who wrote about King and I dig through their archives. Sometimes, I found stuff that the King archives didn't even know they had in their possession. And some of it was just a matter of good timing. The FBI has been releasing lots of new materials. The SCLC, King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, had an official archivist, and his material ended up at the Schomburg Library in Harlem, only recently made available. So I just, turned over every rock and spent 6 years researching every possible angle. And I was thrilled at how much new stuff I found.
As you're writing a book like this, how much are you going back to some of those original texts that I mentioned and either comparing or trying to make it different? Is that a thought in your mind as you're going about this process when it comes to, again, one of the most famous people in American history?
Well, of course, you begin by reading all the books that came before you and learning from them and taking advantage of the scholarship that others have contributed. At the same time, I'm also realizing that there's an opening. The David Garrow books and the Taylor Branch books are really focused on the movement, and King is a key part of the movement. They're not biographies in the strict sense in which, it's cradle to grave. They spend very little time on King's childhood, on his ancestry, on his education. So there's a chance here, I feel like, to write a much more intimate portrait. And that only comes from studying the others. And I should also say that I'm also the beneficiary of all the research materials that David Garrow and Taylor Branch and Stephen Oates compiled, because they're very generous in sharing that material now.
Thankfully, Martin Luther King is not too far into the past, although maybe in some ways it seems like ancient history. He died about 50 years ago. There are still people alive who knew him, and you were able to interview a number of those people. How big of a deal is it to be able to put together a true picture of someone, given you're able to go to people who actually saw and met the man, as opposed to, an Abraham Lincoln or George Washington?
It makes a huge difference. You can have all the papers in the world. You can have diaries, you can have memoirs, you can have video footage, but to go and talk to somebody who knew the man, who drove long nights through the dark streets of Alabama with King in the car, who listened to records with him around the fireplace during casual moments, people who knew him growing up, who helped him deliver newspapers. Those kinds of interviews are invaluable, and you can ask folks, what was he really like to be around? What was it like to be in the room with him? I asked Reverend Bernard Lafayette, what did he smell like? And you get some strange looks when you ask those questions.
It's a good reporting question. Did you find that their memories often jibed with the cold, hard facts of the records you were finding?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And of course, sometimes people embellish, they make stuff up. And the longer you live, the more right you feel like you have to put yourself at the center of the story. But, you have to factor for all that.
Did you find that the passage of time encouraged them to participate more than if he'd been, let's say, dead only 10 years?
Well, they definitely felt in some cases more free to discuss some of King's flaws, knowing that Coretta wasn't going to read it. Unfortunately, Coretta passed away. So especially when it came to some of his, infidelities, some of his friends and colleagues were more open to discussing that now than they might have been, 10 or 20 years ago.
All right, so I've asked a lot of process questions here. I want to get into some of the content. The opening sentence of the prologue is that Martin Luther King became a founding father of America. What do you believe is this lasting kind of rule, the lasting pillar of our society that makes him on par with those who wrote the original rule book of American politics and government and our society, and on par with those who fought the Revolutionary War? Martin Luther King as a founding father, why?
Well, the founding fathers wrote the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, as a promise. It was not just a set of rules. It's a promise of what they hope and expect America to be. And of course, they wrote it with the knowledge that it was not completely true, that it did not include all citizens, that it did not mean freedom and justice for all, that all men were not created equal. Some men were 3/5 equal. And it took Martin Luther King to bring us closer to fulfilling that promise. I think closer than we've ever been. It took Martin Luther King at the age of 26 to speak up and to say, Black people in America were going to show this country how to become a true democracy, how to fulfill the promises that made by Jefferson and Washington and Madison and Monroe.
Who were Delia and Jim King? Where and when did they live? And how did their origin begin to pave the way for a Martin Luther King Sr. and then a Martin Luther King Jr.?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray-baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Delia and Jim King were King's paternal grandparents, and they grew up and worked in Stockbridge, Georgia, raised their family as sharecroppers, working on a farm owned by white people about 20 miles south of Atlanta under horrible conditions, working on land that they could never own, working on land that they could not even really profit from, making just enough to keep paying off the landlord. And Jim King was driven to alcoholism and to violence by his mistreatment. Delia King, however, maintained her faith, maintained her belief in God, and raised her son, Mike King, who would become Martin Luther King Sr., to become a pastor and a preacher, and made it possible for Martin Luther King Jr. to be raised in the spirit of optimism that America could be a better country for Black people.
And we're talking 1860s and 1870s here. You tell an incredible story in Michael's early life. This is Martin Luther King Sr. that shows the system that they lived under, African Americans, Black Americans. The story shows that, but it also shows the inborn desire that the family had to fight back. Tell us the story of the original kind of feeling and the way Michael Sr. felt as he begins to experience the class and society that he is in.
I opened chapter 1 with this scene that came from Daddy King. That's what everybody called Martin Luther King Sr., Daddy King's unpublished autobiography. And he tells the story of one day being sent by his mother with a bucket of milk and butter to a neighbor who had a sick cow. And the Kings, even though they didn't have much, were sharing what little they had with this neighbor who had it worse off. And along the way, Mike King is attacked by a white mill owner. Bucket is knocked to the ground. Mike is kicked and punched, goes back home bleeding. And his mother says, "Who did this to you?" And demands to know who did this. Mike tells her. She goes back to the white mill owner and beats him up. A Black woman in Stockbridge, Georgia, beating up a white man of wealth, was incredibly provocative. And she said, "Nobody does this to my boy," and takes him home and says, "Do not tell your father what happened here today, because if your father tries to retaliate, he'll be killed." And sure enough.
Oh, go ahead, please.
Yeah, sure enough, Jim King hears about this, also confronts the white mill owner, and is then chased out of town by a white mob, and is forced to go into hiding for months, separated from his family.
How did Michael King become a preacher, and how does that start to foreshadow what happens to his son?
Well, Michael King sees his mother's faith, sees how she gives to others, even when she has little for herself, and how even in the face of horrible racism, she believes that God will look out for her. And he leaves Stockbridge at the age of 12 or 13 and walks with his shoes over his shoulder so he doesn't wear them out toward the train and into Atlanta, goes and starts working at a railroad, and then starts teaching himself to read, to write, and to preach. So he becomes a preacher, really an itinerant preacher, traveling around to churches that need somebody to deliver sermons on Sundays, and then enrolls in school, and then enrolls at Morehouse College, and really begins to lift himself up. Marries into a relatively prosperous family of preachers at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and really begins to make a new life. He's a great hero. Martin Luther King Sr. Is somebody we don't talk enough about.
Explain the neighborhood that he ends up raising his family in, Sweet Auburn. Great name for a neighborhood, by the way.
Yeah,
very cool.
Auburn Avenue in Atlanta is perhaps the finest Black street in America, as some writers call it. It's where Black people in Atlanta have congregated after a series of racist attacks on the Black community forced them to sort of huddle together, and they've formed a really successful social and economic community there. There's Black banks and Black restaurants, Black hotels, Black insurance companies, and also this wonderful church, Ebenezer Baptist, where Martin Luther King Sr. marries into the family of the preacher, marries Alberta Williams, and makes himself the heir apparent to the pulpit at Ebenezer Baptist.
I thought it was really cool that you had the first experience that Daddy King had with racism, and also the first experience that Martin Luther King Jr. had with racism. Give us Martin Luther King Jr.'s experience and how that begins to shape his views on what's happening, not just in Sweet Auburn and across Atlanta, but across American society.
You know, almost every Black biography you read, almost every Black memoir has a moment when the subject discovers American racism for the first time. And Martin Luther King was 6 years old when he discovered it for the first time. There was a little grocery store across the street from his house on Auburn Avenue, and the grocery store was owned by a white family. And there was a boy whose father owned the store who was the same age as Martin Luther King Jr. And they played together on the streets while their parents were working, except when they went to kindergarten, they went to separate schools. And after kindergarten one day, after school, the white boy announced that he's not allowed to play anymore with this Black friend because his parents told him that Black or colored children, as he put it, weren't as good as he was. So Martin Luther King goes to his parents and says, can you explain this to me? And his parents have to sit him down and basically explain to him the entire history of American race relations, from enslavement to Jim Crow. And they tell him, don't believe that you're not as good as anybody. Don't let this cause you to hate white people. But Martin Luther King at age 6 says he's determined to hate white people forever because of this interaction and this loss of a friend. And it takes him a while, but the Bible is stronger than his hate. And he comes to believe that, white people are not all bad and that he can't hate them.
I was struck by how much violence he faced in his own personal life. As a kid, Daddy King had some truly brutal moments. How did someone who was hit as a child insist that violence not be used in the fight of his life, the fight against racism?
It really is remarkable because King was a victim of what today we might call child abuse. He was spanked and strapped routinely and often in public, on the front porch of the house or in the backyard where neighbors could see. And yet he grows up, and again, I think the Bible has a lot to do with it. He grows up believing in nonviolence, and I think some of it also comes from his desire to prove that he's better than his father, that he doesn't have to resort to violence in the same way. Even when he's being strapped by his father, as a little boy, he makes up his mind he's never going to yell, he's never going to cry, he's not going to let his father see his pain.
How does he start to chart his life? How does he begin to say, I'm going to go to college, but also take this kind of religious route that Dad took?
He's always very ambitious. He skips a couple of grades. He tries to sneak into kindergarten a year early. He goes to Morehouse at the age of...
Wait a minute, son.
Yeah.
Hold on. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's got a lot of ambition, and he is, of course, raised in the church. He's learning to recite Bible verses before he can read. And even for a while, when he thinks he might want to try something other than preaching for a career, he knows he wants to fight for justice. And that comes from his reading of the Bible, of course. But he thinks maybe I'll be a lawyer. The NAACP is starting to make a big impact. Maybe I'll be a doctor. But he's pulled back again and again to the religion and to the philosophy that undergirds the religion.
As I was reading the parts about his obsessive dating, and he admits it in the quotes you have in the book, he's like, hey, this is one of my hobbies. How do you explain the obsessive dating? I was thinking sort of like it feels like JFK, where you have like a really whip smart kid who is attractive and is funny and people want to be around, and it turns into this kind of obsessive chasing of women. So I guess my question is it, I have a couple questions, but is it essential to his character that we understand that, or can it be chalked up to what most boys would do if they could?
Oh man, that's a good question. Even from a young age, he's a charmer and he loves the ladies. He would go to dances as a chaperone. He would offer to be a church chaperone at the dances, and he would separate the boys and girls if they started getting too close. And then he'd use that opportunity to hit on the girls.
Which side did he go to? Right. Yeah.
I mean, genius, right?
Yeah.
And his
all you with me, all you over here.
I'll look after you. But one of his good childhood friends, a girl named June Dobbs, who became Dr. June Dobbs Butts and became a sex therapist, told me that King was never monogamous a day in his life, that even as a teenager, he would complain all the time about the rumors that his father was an adulterer, that everybody in the community knew that Daddy King was messing around with women. And young ML was determined not to be like his father. But as June said to me, God help him, he never had a chance.
Is it essential that we understand that part of him to understand the character? I would argue, we don't have to get into it now, but I would argue that understanding JFK's womanizing is important to understanding the type of president he was and how he ran his administration. Do we have to understand this part of him to get the contribution, the rest of the contribution?
Well, it helps us understand why he failed to really see the important role women might play in the civil rights movement. He failed to see why women's rights, women's justice might be an important part of a civil rights campaign. But it also helps explain why the FBI was so successful in attacking him, because they knew he had this weakness, and they were able to weaponize that to try to divide and conquer the civil rights movement. So King's flaws end up having profound consequences.
So many important people seem to take on new names later in life, and lots of unimportant people. But you think of a couple of them. Leslie Lynch King is, of course, Gerald Ford when he becomes president. William Blythe is Bill Clinton when he becomes president. How did we get Michael King? How did we get Martin Luther King Jr. from Michael King Jr.?
Yeah, he's born Michael King with no middle name on his birth certificate, and his father is still Mike King at the time of young Mike's birth. He's called Little Mike. He's called ML, and then his father first changes his name to ML, and then introduces Martin Luther after traveling to Germany and learning more about Martin Luther, the reformer. And in part, he's doing it because he's impressed by what he's learned about Martin Luther, but also because it adds a sense of dignity. This is a former sharecropper who is trying to establish himself as a big city preacher, and he feels like it's a more dignified name. And then he informs his son, who's about 5 years old at the time, that, hey, guess what, kid? Your name is changing too. So little Mike becomes little ML and eventually Martin Luther King. But it's not really until college or after college, into seminary and graduate school at Boston, that he begins calling himself Martin.
I made a dumb mistake. I should have asked how he wound up with Coretta before I asked the name question, because it was right after I asked about women in his character. How did he wind up with Coretta?
Well, Coretta was one of the many women he dated in Boston when he was studying for his doctorate at Boston University. And when he was introduced to Coretta, he instantly said, "You're the one," even though he continued to date other women for a little while. But he liked Coretta, I think, because she was more of an activist than he was at that point. Of course, she was beautiful and she was intelligent and she had a promising career as a singer, but many of the women that King dated were beautiful and intelligent with promising careers. I really think the key to understanding why he ended up marrying Coretta is that he was moved by her passion for justice, that she had been to Antioch College and had already been involved in a lot of civil rights protests, and he hadn't been involved in any yet at that point.
It's really hard to picture the civil rights movement, certainly without Martin Luther King or Coretta Scott King, but it's hard to picture it without religion also as playing a central role. Preaching is such an important part of it, and even to this day, many of the civil rights leaders in our country started out as reverends or are also practicing reverends. How did he start to fit religion into this idea that we should all be treated equally?
It was essential, and it's essential for a number of reasons. First of all, back then, something like 75% of all Americans belonged to a church and were in church every Sunday. So you had an audience that was organized and ready to listen. But the other key principle is that King was using religion to sort of seize the higher moral ground, to say to America, we are only trying to do what God commands us to do. God does not distinguish between the races. God does not say that some people should be better treated than others. So he's able to appeal to people who haven't really heard that before, haven't thought about it in those moral terms. So his religious faith and his obvious, intelligence, his great familiarity with the Bible and with philosophy really opens a lot of minds, especially for people in the North who haven't really been paying attention to this stuff.
I was struck in your book by how simple Rosa Parks made at the time the bus boycott. Like, it was like, well, I don't know, I didn't want to sit over there, and so I didn't. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, but it was, she sums it up really simply. It's of course, a much more, as most history is, a much more interesting, more elaborate story. How did Martin Luther King get mixed up in this fight in this relatively, well, I don't want to say small town, but, not a New York or a Boston? How did he wind up in this fight in Montgomery, Alabama, over buses and who should sit where?
He's the right man in the right place at the right time, because he accepts this job as the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. And he's really hoping just to be there a few years and then maybe get a teaching job at a university. And it just so happens that there's, a storm brewing, and that for years, really, Black people in Montgomery have been complaining about the segregated buses and the indignity they suffer riding. And it just so happens that King, 1 year into his tenure at Dexter Avenue, happens to be there when the bus boycott begins, when Rosa Parks gets arrested and the community is looking for someone to lead them. And nobody really knows King yet. That's a big part of why they choose him to speak that night of the first night of the protest, because he hasn't made any enemies in town yet. He's got a reputation for being a pretty good speaker, and they just throw him up there in front of this enormous crowd, and he finds his voice, and the audience really responds in a way that I don't think they would have responded to anybody else. He was the perfect vessel at that moment.
Is there an important quote or important point from, and I don't want to put you on the spot, I know you've got a lot of stuff in your head here from Martin Luther King. Is there an important point that he makes that you think resonated with the people in those days who said, this is a really good preacher who makes great points?
The key thing that night, December 5th, 1955, was that he said, it may be that it's going to take Black people to teach America what justice really means, what democracy really means. And if we are wrong in demanding these rights, then the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, the Bible is wrong. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of the United States is wrong. And he makes it seem not only attainable, but inevitable. Of course we are right. And of course the government, of course the whole country will eventually see it that way. It just seems so logical. And King expresses it so beautifully that the people are ready to follow him anywhere.
I was really struck by how much violence he faced. We've talked about his desire to remain nonviolent, but it really must have been difficult for him at times. He must have wanted to, and maybe did, throw his fist through a wall or something like that, because the number of threats he was under, the number of attacks his own family faced, and people who were close to him faced, and young people faced, and other marchers faced. How did the constant threat of being physically harmed begin to weigh on him and shape the way he would craft this fight for equal rights?
I think he was truly traumatized, and I think we should celebrate his strength, but we should not forget that this had a profound effect on him emotionally, psychologically. Early on in Montgomery, his home is bombed with his wife and baby daughter in the house, and they survive. Soon after that, he's stabbed in the chest while signing books in Harlem. His house is then shot at, windows blown out. He's arrested at one point and taken on a 2-hour ride through the dark, winding roads of Georgia with a snarling German shepherd in the paddy wagon with him. If you don't think these things are going to scar you, even Martin Luther King, it's bound to leave a mark, and it does. He struggles. He's afraid constantly that death could come at any moment.
What did he think of the people who said, you've got to be tougher than this, meaning physically tough? We've got to start fighting back. The Black Power movement, which we've done an episode on with a great author, wrote a wonderful book, Mark Whitaker. What was his response to people who said, we've got to go faster? This is just taking too long, waiting for the laws to come to our side.
Yeah, plenty of people who marched by his side said, "You can turn the other cheek, Dr. King, but if somebody hits me, I'm hitting them back." And he was mocked by other activists like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael. They called him, weak. And King insisted, and this comes straight from the Bible, it comes from Jesus. He insisted that there's more strength in resisting the urge to violence. There's more strength required to turn the other cheek.
How did you, this is a somewhat personal question, but I think it should be asked. How did you write this book as a white person, as somebody who just simply won't face the kinds of physical threats that people who were Black faced during the civil rights movement?
Well, I tried to be humble and to ask for help, and certainly to interview everybody I could, and then also to ask scholars in the field, Black scholars in particular, to read for me and tell me what I was missing, to look for my blind spots, and of course, friends as well, friends and relatives, people of color, women in particular, asking them to read it and tell me what I was missing. And there's no way to account for all of your own human blind spots. We all have blind spots, and I just had to work harder to try to minimize those.
There's a wonderful book called Kennedy and King, which you may or may not have read. It's a terrific book, and it's about it actually the beginning of that book is what you described as he's put in the back of that squad car and taken through the backwoods of I think it was Georgia to a prison, and he's petrified for his life, and he wonders if he's going to die or not. Ultimately, that winds up playing a key role in the 1960 election, and John F. Kennedy seizes on this moment that is kind of begging for a political solution, and JFK ends up really succeeding politically in a lot of ways because he's able to kind of craft this way to get him out of jail. How and why, based on the King side of this story, do you think it just resonated and begged for a presidential candidate to get involved?
Well, it was frightening. And, King's wife hadn't heard from him. This was, a maximum security penitentiary in Reidsville, Georgia. And there was great fear that, what could happen. Every Black person in America knew that you could disappear quite easily once you're taken into police custody and certainly taken to a rural penitentiary. So for Kennedy to call Coretta and to check in and to work to try to get King released made a big impression, not just on King, but on the entire Black community. And some people think it helped swing the election for Kennedy. And of course, Nixon was urged by some of his advisors to call, and he chose not to.
I just realized we had Stephen Levingston on our show to talk about his Obama and Biden book. So that's cool. I mentioned him. I just realized he was the author of that same book. As we get to the "I Have a Dream" speech, and that's during the Kennedy administration, how did you find going back through and acknowledging the fact that line became a key line that I mentioned at the beginning, and seeing the incredibly deep prose and the incredibly beautiful way he articulates the desire for justice in America? How did you take that speech and deconstruct it in a scholarly way?
Well, it's always challenging for any book to write about the moment that people know best. How are you going to add something new to it? And how am I certainly can't match the majesty of King's oratory. You're reading these words flatly on a page. So what can I do to try to make you feel the power of that moment? And there were a couple of things that I thought about. One is I wanted to remind you that the first half of the speech, which we don't quote very much, is actually the more powerful part when it comes to the content. It's in the first half of the speech that King talks about police brutality, about the reparations that Black people are due in this country, about the inequality of economics in this country, and that America has a great deal of work to do. And he's really delivering a radical speech in that first half. It's the second half of the speech where he starts talking about the dream that moves people, that really inspires a sense of hope and leaves people that day feeling like they need to go back home and make the world a better place. So it's a two-part speech, and I really wanted to convey the content of the first half and the feeling of the second half.
I went back and watched the tape, the video, the film of Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act, and eventually he does hand a pen to Martin Luther King, and they have a quick exchange of words, at least in public. How did you find their relationship? What do you think we need to know about the way he lobbied the president of the United States to pass, in particular, that law, but then also work to secure voting rights?
King was always deeply frustrated with politicians. He felt like even though Kennedy and
I
Johnson
can't imagine why. I'm just kidding. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Even though they had good intentions, he couldn't understand why they weren't always ready to do the right thing morally, why they had to hedge their bets, why they had to worry about how it was going to affect votes in the South. And it was deeply frustrating to him. But he learned that he just had to hold their feet to the fire, that he had to create conflict in places like Birmingham and Selma to force the president's hand, to make them change the balance of equations so that it became necessary, that they didn't have a choice about staying on the sidelines anymore. And when it came to Johnson, I think King felt like he had a great ally, especially when Johnson took office. Their relationship was very warm. But over time, that relationship starts to chill. And it's in large part because the surveillance of King by the FBI is having an effect. It's taking its toll. And J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, is feeding all kinds of information to the Kennedys first and then to Johnson about King's personal life, stuff that has no bearing on the civil rights movement whatsoever, but it's damaging the relationships.
What do you think he was thinking? How much do we know about what he was thinking? And I will admit I am not to that part in the book yet, but I'm just at the part where he's arrested in Georgia, so 1960. What do we know about what he thought about the moment that this major piece of legislation that still has a major impact on our society today was signed?
You have to remember that King grew up in deep segregation of the South, and when he first traveled north, he would take the train from Atlanta, and when he got to D.C., he would have to move. He could move from the back of the train to the front. And then when he went home from the north, he would have to transfer to the segregated section of the train again. So to see the law change, to say as a kid that he wanted to help kill Jim Crow, that he wanted to be involved in the struggle, and then to be there signing while LBJ signs this legislation, to be handed a pen, I think King must have felt enormous pride that they had fundamentally changed American law, but he was still frustrated because there were still so many ways in which Black people were being treated unequally.
I got a few more wrap-up questions, but I do want to ask before we wrap things up, the big piece of news that came out of this book, and this book has been applauded by people really all over America, and by people who knew King, and by other scholars, and it's really wonderful to see all the stuff come in that I see on Twitter that you've been posting and other people have been posting. But the big piece of news related around the relationship, or related to the relationship between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Explain how you found these incredible sources and documents, and you were able to shed new light on the way they got along and what they thought of each other.
King and Malcolm have often been portrayed as antagonists, and they were to some extent because Malcolm X in particular liked to criticize King and found it useful to position himself, to posture himself as the more radical alternative. But in fact, they had a lot more in common, especially as they matured. James Baldwin wrote that they were fairly indistinguishable by the end in their philosophies. But we have this quote from Martin Luther King that has become repeated over and over. It's in textbooks. It's the quote from his interview with Playboy magazine. Alex Haley conducted the interview. And in that interview, as published by Playboy, King says that Malcolm's fiery demagogic oratory is bringing nothing but despair to the Black people of America. And it turns out that King never said that. I found the original transcript of the interview in Alex Haley's archives. And in that interview, it turns out that Haley had taken King's answer to a question about radical Islamics, to the Nation of Islam in particular, a question that related specifically about the Nation of Islam, and he had flipped it and put it so that it looked like King was saying that about Malcolm. And in fact, when he was asked about Malcolm, King said, "Listen, I don't think I have all the answers. I think I can learn from Malcolm." So there was much more of a possible alliance there, but the media was interested in dividing them and conquering the civil rights movement in part by dividing them.
What does it say about the way our media works and the way history works that 50, 60 years later, there are still new clues to uncover?
Well, it says that you can't trust anything you read, that you got to check it out. But I also hope it suggests that, there are still good reporters out there, still good researchers out there trying to uncover the truth.
What's it like to stand in that spot where he was killed. I saw you posted on Twitter I think it was a couple of days ago, that you were in the spot where Martin Luther King was assassinated. How do you deal with that, being in that location, in that place? What do you think about when you're there?
Well, it's terribly tragic to think about the fact that this man was taken from us, and that our government and our culture, our media, created an environment that would make someone think that it was a good idea to go out and kill, one of our greatest moral leaders. So you can't help but think about the violence that shook this country, that still shakes this country, and how racial antagonism is being used to divide us, and that happens still today. There's still the echoes of that violence, inspired in part by our failure to really embrace King's message.
If that hadn't happened, he'd only be 94 years old. How do you imagine the rest of his career playing out?
Who knows? I asked Andrew Young that question, and he said that a lot of people complain that King was losing popularity, that he was losing his effectiveness. But Young really challenges that. Young thinks that he was getting ready to shift into a much more active political career, that he was going to move the movement beyond issues of race and voting rights, that he was going to embrace human rights, and that he only would have gotten more radical and more effective in the years to come. That's, something we can only speculate, but I like to think so.
Was there a question you kept coming to and saying, gosh, I wish I could just ask him this question to clear something up?
There's so many questions about decisions he made, and his efforts at balancing all of these different interests, and how he managed to keep so many people happy, trying to the people who thought he was too conservative, people who thought he was too radical. But I guess what I'd really love to ask him is just how he overcame the fear, how he continued to double down on his beliefs, to go from fighting for integration to fighting against militarism and materialism and poverty and hunger, and knowing that there was a target on his back. How do you get up every day and do that? And I would just wish that I could ask him, how he felt about that.
Coolest artifact you came across? Personal item that you were able to view or maybe hold?
Oh man, I've seen his shoes. I've seen. I haven't held it. Let me think. I don't know that I've. Wow, you stumped me there. Got to think about it for a second.
We can come back to it.
Yeah, let me think. I feel like there was something, and now I'm blanking on it.
What's his advice for us today?
The nice thing about King is that when you ask, what would he say today, he already said it. And what he said was that
you can just take the same words and put it.
Yeah. What he said is that we must never lose hope. And sometimes today it feels pretty hopeless. We feel like we're, irreparably divided, that we can't ever really change our government, our society, that we're, shouting into the wind. But man, King had it worse than we did, and he didn't lose hope.
Us local reporters, us news reporters, are used to writing in all kinds of crazy places. I don't know that I've heard about the laundry room yet, but apparently that's where you do a lot of writing. Explain your process. Where not your whole process, but how did you put this thing together? Where were you, and how did that environment shape the work you did?
Well, I was lucky to start before COVID, so I was able to get out and interview people in person. And then when COVID hit, I was stuck in my office, which is also the home laundry room. And
like every good reporter, you're writing in weird places sometimes.
You're right where you can. And I have to have all my materials around me. I can't go to a coffee shop. I can't go, even renting an office space doesn't really make sense, because I need all my stuff in one place. And so during COVID, I had 4 people at home in the house all the time, kids doing school, coming in and asking me to make sandwiches. My little one thought it was really funny to sneak up on me with a water gun, like at least 3 times a day, because I don't seem to be working. I'm just sitting there thinking.
Right.
It doesn't look like I'm really working. So it was pretty rough. But at the same time, I'm lucky that I had these folks to talk to, because one of the benefits actually of COVID was that all these old folks who I interviewed in person were now stuck at home, and they were happy when I called every day and asked and checked in on them.
You spent 10 years probably writing this book.
About 6.
About 6 years writing this book. And it's 550 pages of truly worthwhile prose all the way through. Have you given any thought at all to what you might do next?
Oh yeah, I give it a lot of thought, and I haven't settled on the next subject yet. King is a pretty tough act to follow.
Yeah. All right. So we'll let you go on that question. In terms of newspapers, what was your favorite paper to work at? The Journal News, the Times Picayune in New Orleans, the Dallas Morning News, or the Wall Street Journal?
I loved every newspaper job I ever had. New Orleans was the wildest, most fun place to be a reporter right out of college. At 21,
That's
23 years
good.
old,
That's
working in
good.
New Orleans. Man, that was a blast.
What's going to happen in newspapers? Do you worry about it? I'm sure
I
you
worry
do.
about it all the time. They've
Yeah.
already suffered tremendously, and we're already feeling the effects. Not having local news coverage in small, medium-sized towns is bad for democracy. And I don't know that we're going to get the newspapers back, but we still need local journalism of some kind, and you got to support it any chance you get.
I love asking this question to wrap things up. For Jeffrey, who did you dedicate the book to and why?
So I have two biological kids and one kid who came to us through guardianship. And Jeffrey is that third kid who came through guardianship. I was in the Big Brother program. Met him when he was 7. When he was 14, his mother died, and he came to live with us. And he's now 32 years old and
he's a
wonderful
giant,
young man. And he's a big part of our family. So he got the book dedicated to him.
Do you think there was a relationship between the story of Martin Luther King and the story of Jeffrey? Something that you can connect between the two?
Well, Jeffrey's dad was African American. He never met him. His father died when Jeffrey was 1. So I felt like, and I just feel like Jeffrey suffered and triumphed more than maybe anyone I know. And Martin Luther King certainly suffered and triumphed more than most people.
Jonathan Eig, the author of King, A Life. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Check out the book. Check out his website, which is jonathaneig.com. He's on Twitter at Jonathan Eig. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.